In our study of the life divine, Sri Aurobindo has been describing the stages through which nature takes the evolving human kind to an awakening of the inner spiritual possibilities, using primarily four approaches, as we saw earlier: religion, occultism, spiritual philosophy, and the direct experience. We are studying how religion unfolds through various stages, and in the portion which we saw earlier, Sri Aurobindo described how nature led the early human to the vague sense of the infinite and the invisible surrounding the physical being. And through various steps, learning to relate to those powers behind that intuitive or subliminal sense, learning to organize the relationship with those powers into some kind of form of practice, which had a mix of an occult, a religio-ethical form, and certain mystical elements of knowledge or experience. The mind attempted to systematize this knowledge, but all of this at that stage is still very close to the same instinctive feel that the animal has. And so there is a profound implication there, that there is a phase where the human being has developed some element of the intellect, but the primary perception of these deeper realities is still dependent on an instinctive feel which is common to animals. We feel, but we don't know what it is. It is not a higher intuition. It is the same instinctive feel by which the animal senses danger or opportunity, which nature uses at first in the human to sense a deeper, diviner possibility. The sense of the infinite, the sense of the hidden, the sense of the invisible. And one of the implications of this observation is that animals too, using the same faculty, have that sense of something deeper, of an infinite and an invisible. And it has been a common human experience that when brought into sacred spaces, animals behave very differently. They suddenly become quiet. They become receptive. They are as if stupefied by this presence, but they are also attracted, drawn to it sometimes. You will remember the mother narrating how at some point she was playing in a church and she played the music, and after a while, when she stopped, there was a frog, I think, on the ledge which went croak, croak, saying, "Go on, go on." Or we've known of people who sang and cows or other animals came close and would listen. But they were not so attracted to music which was merely lyrical or rhythmic. They were attracted to something deeper in the call, in the aspiration that filled the singing. We know also from studies that cows who are exposed to beautiful, uplifting music, not exciting music, but uplifting music, which is bordering on the spiritual, they are more relaxed, they give more milk, they are more healthy, they have better resilience to infections and illnesses. And so in many commercial spaces, they want to use music for this purpose. But really it is tapping into that deeper sensitivity that is there in animals. And if you consider that the animal is unable to access the higher intellectual possibilities, their existing access to the spiritual sensitivity is never lost. Whereas in the human, as the higher intellect develops, this more subtle and instinctive opening tends to be suppressed or pushed back, which is what he describes later. When first the mind has organized these things, there is, as he says, an amalgam of primitive intuitions, occult ritual, religio-social ethics, mystical knowledge or experience symbolized in myth. And all of this is a very superficial external stage of human religion. And even if they are crude, they grow rapidly, and in some cultures, they acquire a great significance and power. But subsequently, as the mental life grows, and that is nature's first focus in the human development, and the intellectualization begins, the initial intuitive, instinctive, and subliminal formations are overlaid with structures erected by a growing force of reason and mental intelligence. And we were reading this portion last time, where this overlay creates a first intellectual superstructure that begins then to become so strong, so imposing, so independent that it suppresses the substructure of intuition, instinct, and subliminal forms. And so, as a result, the presence and the living influence of the gods and invisible powers begins to recede, and everything is replaced by this mechanical explanation of nature's workings. The spiritual element is still kept because intellect is unable to somehow replace that. But the occult element, the mystical element, the intellect can replace by this explanation of how things are and the science that it now creates. And the occult elements of religion, though still held as beliefs or preserved, but also buried in rites and myths, lose their significance and diminish, and the intellectual element increases. We see this passage, particularly several hundred years ago, all over the world. As the intellect is coming into its own, these things are still there, but their force weakens, their significance is lost. Finally, where and when the intellectual element increases, where and when the intellectual tendency becomes too strong, there is a movement to cut out everything but creed, institution, formal practice, and ethics. Because these the intellect can not remove. If you remove those, the distinctive character of the religions itself is lost. And these can be held in an intellectual framework. Oh, these are beliefs, these are traditions, these are habits, these are our distinctive forms. And so the intellect can accept them even if they don't make too much logical sense. But everything else that filled those things, the juice of experience, is pushed out. And even the element of spiritual experience dwindles, and it is considered sufficient to rely only on faith, emotional fervor, and moral conduct. This is the stage you will see in a large part of the religions as they survive today. If you go to spaces where Christianity is strong, particularly, let's say, the evangelical groups or the Southern American spaces, you will find the Christianity that is taught or practiced is associated with family values. They will say, Christian family values is what we live for, we stand for, we want to protect against the corrupting influences of whatever modernism or liberalism that they see. But what are they protecting? Family values, not the teaching of Christ, not the spiritual content. They are still primarily moral conduct. Yes, there is an emotional fervor when they go to church, On the Sundays, they may sing and dance with the fervor of the passages, texts read out, and rely only on faith. The teaching actually reduces itself to, as long as you believe in Christ and the Bible and you live your moral life, you will go to heaven. That's it. It's been reduced to that little box. Similarly, when you see how Buddhism is taught, especially in the form when it comes into Europe or the West generally, the elements which involve the true sense of commitment to an ideal and a practice and the meaning, the deeper sense of Buddhism itself has been forgotten. So somebody who's initiated, let's say, goes through the 3 vows, may repeat the 3 vows as a ritual daily, and it is enough that he is now in that system, born in that routine and believes in it, and that is his spiritual life. It stops there. Or even in the more secular forms of teaching, the 3 vows are removed. And Buddhism is reduced to a logical system of training the mind. So they will say Buddhism is not a religion, it is a philosophy, and you have to understand this is how you have to see it, this is how you have to think it. And perhaps even in certain schools or lineages, the primary emphasis given is to the philosophy and the logic of the teaching. Even the Dalai Lama is on record stating that if science can show logically or by experimentation that some of the Buddhist beliefs are wrong, then I will drop those beliefs and follow the scientific proof. Which is a very fine statement, because you're now bringing Buddhism at par with the power of the intellect and the logic of the intellect. But it misses the point that that was not what Buddha taught. That was not what the tradition itself has carried. What it taught was that there is a deeper underlying, let's say, consciousness or a perspective or experience of reality that can be free from the suffering. And there is a process by which you can master your mind, master your thought, and free yourself from this domain or this poise of or experience of suffering and live free of suffering. And your logical explanation of science is irrelevant to that, really. And yet, it has been reduced now to a point where you can barely distinguish it from just another logical philosophical argument. And it's not too different, even if you go to spaces in the Southeast Asian countries. I recall reading a few years ago how it was the Thai government that had announced that all the police force, the policemen, would have to go through 2 years of compulsory training in the Buddhist monastic order. For what? And if you see, the objective was not the spiritual content, but the moral content, the ethical content, which the Buddhist framework gave. If you look at yoga as it is taught today, and if you take the framework that is primarily taken in what is called classical yoga, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras is what is primarily of concern, because that is the most objective, the most physically accessible. And even those where they point to higher and deeper spiritual content, you study them to pass an exam, but there is nothing of the practice that remains. You read about, you study the yamas and the niyamas, the don'ts and the do's, which are primarily ethical and moral, or at least they're reduced to ethical and moral things. Don't speak a lie. Yes, it's an ethical rule. You study it, you read about it, you think it. But none of the students of the yoga class are required to put that into practice. You just have to learn that and repeat that to pass your exam, and it stops there. But why should you not speak a lie? Well, that's the first base, to be a good person. No, that's not the point. The point of not lying was, if you want to rise into a consciousness which is divine, which is innately true, which is truth, revealing itself spontaneously, then to participate in an act which is contrary to truth, is to disconnect you from the divine. To speak a lie, obviously, to think a lie even is unacceptable. To act a lie is unacceptable. So, truth or non lying is not merely of speech or action or behavior in relation to others, it is a deeper spiritual practice to put yourself in alignment with the divine consciousness as a preparation for emergence in that which is the spontaneous flowing of truth, of dharma. And that significance is completely forgotten, and lying is reduced to a moral factor only and kept at a superficial level. The aspect of conscious surrender, which is also referred to in the Yoga Sutras, is lost, or occasionally comes up as referred to in certain more specialized schools which want to deepen the spiritual element. But if you deepen too much, you don't get enough students. And if you want to survive economically, you need to have a certain number of students. So, as Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase in the synthesis of yoga, humanity wants only a modicum of spirituality. A tiny dose, and then you're happy with that, but not too much. That becomes excessive. And just to show the contrast, there are schools which will give you a teacher training certification within 15 days. You sit through, go through their program, and you're certified to teach. And there are other schools in India, both are in India. There are other schools which require to be living it for 5 years. Live the values until you change as a person fundamentally. Your whole thought process changes. You begin to relate to a deeper reality and begin to feel its influence in your life. Then only you're ready to teach, even if it's just basic asanas. But they cannot separate the basic asanas from the deeper culture of yoga. You cannot separate basic asanas from the whole change of lifestyle and thinking and food and how you sleep and what you live by and what you live for. And if you don't change as a person, you cannot be a teacher. But none of this is practical. And so, with the increasing intellectualization and its superficialization, every tradition, every religion is facing the same disruptive tendency. Rely only on faith, emotional fervor, moral conduct, and that's enough. You don't need much more. And what remains is creed, institution, formal practice, and ethics. If you look at the church, it's a powerful example of what remains purely as an institution. It is today, the Pope recently made an observation that there is a whole deluge of scandals of priests involved in sexual perversions and excesses. But what does that say about the church itself? You could become a priest without some of the basic elements of moral conduct, or you kept them only as a superficial appearance. Can the institution itself survive shorn of this? And one begins to wonder at what will happen to religions. But Sri Aurobindo will show you what happens next after this age passes, because this age can only last for so long, because everything begins to break down. He then says, the first amalgam of religion, occultism, and mystic experience is disrupted. And there is a tendency, not by any means universal or complete, but still pronounced or visible, for each of these powers to follow its own way, to its own goal, in its own separate and free character. So now the components of religion have broken apart. The amalgam which had been created is shattered. You will recall the discussion we had last time on the term amalgam and its deeper sense. I wanted to make a slight correction. I had described how the processing of mercury through those 16 stages leads you to a point where it becomes living substance, preparing for a spiritual character even. And in the 16th stage, I had mentioned it becomes gold. It's not so. It becomes the seed that can make gold. It is the philosopher's stone in the Western tradition. In the Indian tradition, it is called the bija. But that's when it has the power to transform. It can take base metals such as iron and turn them into gold. And that's the spiritual power. So Mercury becomes spiritual power on a material level. And in the same way, what was begun as an amalgam that was the origin of religion, had it gone through in a healthy way, could have become a transforming power in humanity, taking the base material of the animal human nature and turning it into divine material. But here, suddenly, because of the interruption introduced by the power of the intellect, this has been fragmented. And so the three components, religion, occultism, and mystical experience, now break away and follow their own paths. Separate and free character. You will see this again today. There is the institution of religion, which is characterized by the church or churches, innumerable variations of them in the West. But at the same time, you have occultism, which is still present, which also creates its own churches. If you go back nearly 100 years, the occult schools or lineages came up in great prominence for a while, and then they went into a kind of a hiding or a secondary form, today again attempting to come forward, but both dark and light forms of occultism. But they are now completely separated from the past forms of religion, but they follow similar institutional structures. And independent of these two is the mystical streams. And it's interesting to see the mystical streams deny both church and formal hierarchy as well as occultism. So you find, for example, in the last 50 years in America, there were a series of, for the last 100 years, let's say, a series of Christian mystics. Thomas Merton is one of them, I believe, who was in a contemplative tradition. He even founded as if a new lineage. There was Teilhard de Chardin, who was also a mystic, who even had glimpses of the possibility of the spiritual transformation of the human being. And he was conscious enough as a mystic to realize it was not his glimpse, but he was as if catching the resonance of somebody else's work or idea. And it's interesting that he was conscious of that. And many others, not always so well known, but often forming little pockets. And what is characteristic of their little schools and lineages is that they formed around the individual who was the mystic. The individual lived a deeper or higher spiritual consciousness. People who were attracted to that came. There was no church, there was no hierarchy, there was no machinery of administration to represent the spiritual power, nor any of the occultism. And you'll find similar tendencies in the Sufi tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, for example, in China, there was Chan master of Buddhism who revived the Chan tradition of Buddhism, and Master Sheng Yen, one of the great teachers of the modern times, who passed away only a few years ago. And he was one of very few who could not only enter those states of immersion in the transcendent consciousness, but had the power to transmit it to his students and prepare his students even to come to that poise of experience. And a few like that. But always you will see with the teacher, a group forms, and with the passing of the teacher, the tendency of the group to lose its force, unless there are enough who have caught that light and that experience and can sustain it. Or often for the purpose of administering the group that forms, an institution is created, and then after the teacher's passing, there's a division in the institution of those who stick to the forms and those who seek the spiritual experience. So this is where we are today, and it's still one more step is needed, a complete denial of religion, occultism, and all that is supra-physical is the last outcome of this stage. A hard paroxysm of the superficial intellect hacking away at the sheltering structures that are refuges for the deeper parts of our nature. This is what you see primarily in the last 100 years. Complete denial of religion, occultism, and all that is supra-physical. By what? By this power of the intellect. And what is the form in which the intellect stands is what we call science. But science acquires its own character almost as a religion, but it stands on the power of the intellect, and it is proud of the fact that it questions and dismisses anything supraphysical. All that is superstition, all that is old religious beliefs, all that is imagination. And it stands with pride on its excessive materialism. So, this last phase is what you're seeing, and Sri Aurobindo gives to it a very interesting phrase. He says, a hard paroxysm of the superficial intellect. Paroxysm is when an illness gives a last burst of asserting its sickness. So, he describes this whole phase almost as a sickness. And the sickness has hung around long enough, and before it dies, it gives a last burst, and then it collapses. So the sickness is characterized by superficial intellect hacking away. And why is it superficial? Because in fact, if you applied your intellect truly as a scientist, instead of dismissing things, you would say, well, let me verify. And the few scientists who did do that discovered that there was a truth to these things. And as a result, they were sidelined by mainstream science. Or, having discovered there is truth to these things, they withdrew from that exploration out of fear for being sidelined. I'll give two examples. One of these is a scientist in MIT, one of the elite institutions of science. In the 1980s, he decided to prove once and for all that supraphysical things were impossible. So he designed what to him was the most complete and undeniable experiment. 1,000 ball bearings, which you pull a lever, they all fall at the same time, pass through channels evenly cut out, made to assemble into two buckets. You pull the lever, they all fall and separate into two buckets at random, jumping about to be equally balanced. And instantly from the weight you can measure the difference. And then he said, we call someone who claims to have psychic powers, concentrate, pull the lever and make more balls fall on the right side or left side and so on. He was so convinced that he had disproved it. When he did the experiment, he discovered instead it worked. People who claimed to have psychic powers could make major shifts of 10% at a time. People who didn't claim to have psychic powers, people picked at random from the streets, still had the power to influence even 5%. In other words, every human being had a psychic power to influence physical matter which is bouncing around, to slightly tilt the complex bouncing process to make a significant change in the overall outcome. And as a dutiful scientist, he documented this, published it. Immediately there was a violent criticism, but a scientist would have said, genuine scientist would have said, well, let's replicate. Let's prove him wrong with our more strict experiments. Nobody bothered. And so one begins to wonder. There are equally other scientists who have done this going back 100 years. J.B. Rhine was one of the most early scientists who did tests with playing cards. He would ask people to visualize or glimpse what the playing card is. They were a pile of playing cards facing down. Guess what the next card is and then pull out, and they would make a note. Pull out and make a note. And as it turned out, for many, there was a striking number of accurate guesses, far above chance. But for many, it seemed as if all the readings were wrong, except they discovered if you took the predictions and matched them with the card, it was an exact listing but one card off. They were predicting not the current card but the card after. Amazing measurements of this kind, and he applied the strictest scientific methods. Series of experiments still ongoing in what is today known as the Institute of Noetic Sciences. You can see their published results. The media will not touch it. Other scientists will not bother to replicate. But they're going strong, using the strictest scientific terms. But this is to point out that science itself, had it been sincere, had it looked deeper with the power of the intellect, it would not have dismissed. That which dismisses is a superficial intellect which is proud of its disbelief and will not even look at the evidence. And this is the problem here. That's why it's a sickness. And what does it do instead? Hacking away the sheltering structures that are refuges for the deeper parts of our nature. The very thing that nature was trying to awaken in the human being, consciousness of our own deeper ranges, consciousness of our own deeper intuitions or subliminal perceptions or instincts. And these are three powers within us which always point to something deeper, higher, and greater than us. But these powers are hidden as if behind the superficial layer of our personality. And they were sheltered, they were protected by these elements of religion, occultism, and mystical experience. As long as the element of religion, occultism, and mystical experience was accepted in society, these elements were not only protected, they were even nourished. They were allowed to grow. If you go today to any part of the world where there is this kind of a very hard reductionist denial by science or by reason, you will find people are also hardened. But there are pockets within them, you will find people sensitive, open, even having a mystical side. And if you probe a little further, you will find they belong to families which have had a strong religious tradition, or families which, although being atheist, were not hard in their denial but allowed that deeper intuition or subliminal sense to flower. The mother herself narrates how she grew up in a Jewish family which was atheistic. So it was interesting that as an atheist family, they were not Jewish in the strict sense. There was not a belief system imposed on the children. They were free to think. But as a Jewish family, there was an element of the culture, of the value of deeper and higher things. And so it created just the right balance necessary at that time, in that age, for a thinking, questioning movement to also explore these inner sensitivities and allow their exploration. And it's been my experience, generally going in the West and particularly going into such spaces, there's always an element in the family or in the culture, in some element of the tradition. They may couch it under some term, family values, but there was some sheltering component. And where the sheltering component was removed, there's this hardening shell which blocks completely all the deeper sensitivities. And sometimes it is sad to see children who had spiritual potential, they pass through the school system where the hardening takes place, and they come through having lost everything. And you talk to them and you're talking to a shell. You cannot feel the person behind. You look in their eyes and it is as if a sheet of glass. You cannot see through. It becomes non-transparent. So what he is pointing to here is these elements were sheltering structures for those deeper possibilities. And if they are hacked away, cut away with violence, you're removing that, there's nothing to protect, and everything tends to close down. We saw this happening also here in the ashram. Children who grew up here, and especially under the daily contact with the mother in the early days, later on reduced but indirect contact, but at least in the atmosphere which was nourishing, they would go, on the insistence of the parents, they would go on a holiday once a year. It was interesting, when the mother started the school here, there were no holidays. Every day was school day. And if at all there was a holiday which was once a month, it was only there for the morning session, not for the evening session, which was the physical training program, which was every day without exception, because body needs rhythm to train. But the morning was given free because it was dedicated to the teachers preparing for the month's program. They needed time to themselves. And so the children were allowed free time, but they were given other activities to do. And it's a very interesting idea. Education, if it is to be true, is a constant journey. It is not limited to the classroom time. And as a school, It starts in the morning at 7:45 and ends in the evening at 7 p.m. You don't have any time where school is finished, now you go and play. Play is part of the school, part of the educational framework, and everything is a learning, growing movement. But on the insistence of parents, the mother had to give in. And she said this, she's giving in only because of parents. They demanded that their children be allowed to visit them. And it was a compromise for 1.5 months. And then mother observes, she said, every time these children go away, one full year of all the work that I have done on them is washed away. And I have to start afresh. Every year, imagine the children who went out, they would be exposed to those very contrary values. They would come back with that dulling influence, and all the inner psychic sensitivity and the spiritual culture would be washed out by something crude, coarse, or ugly desires and values of life which were built on pretense and hypocrisy and vain demonstration of money and wealth. And they would come back with those values. And I've experienced this because as a child, we would feel the children come back and they came with showing off. You know, my parents, we did this, I did that, and I am so great. And you looked at it and you said, what is this vibration? What is this strange thing? And then mother was asked, then why do you continue? She said, you don't know the limits of my patience. But what a waste. But this is what is happening today in the very modern and reductionist values projected in our education. The refuges for the deeper parts of our nature are hacked away and removed. And either those parts are exposed to be stamped out and removed, or they recede to be replaced by hardened and false values. So we recognize the immense contribution that this amalgam of religion and occultism and mystical experience gave to humanity during that phase. And we see now what hard intellectualism does to it. But it cannot last, obviously, because it ends up destroying its own base. So, but still, evolutionary nature keeps alive her ulterior intentions in the minds of a few and uses man's greater mental evolution to raise them to a higher plane and deeper issues. So again we come back to this idea. Who is guiding this whole process? Nature. Nature working inside people. And we have to understand what that means. The impulse within us which makes us curious, we think is ours. The impulse within us which says, what about this? And makes us explore something which others have not explored, we think is our own originality. In fact, it is not. It is nature living inside us who pushes, which we feel as an impulse, and we follow, and it leads us to a discovery, and we say, I have discovered. In fact, it was nature within you that pushed and led you to the discovery. And if you could recognize that, you will say, thank you for this gift. But when that impulse rises, because it is hidden in the substance of our nature, we identify with it and claim it as ours. Ask yourself where the impulse came, and you will not be able to trace it back. You only became conscious of the impulse after it rose up. It was never yours. All you can say, it rose up from deep within me, but from where I cannot say. It could be from your soul, it could be from a deeper layer of nature, but I don't know. But why is it I got it and not someone else? Because within you there was already a certain turn of nature towards inquisitiveness, or a certain turn of nature towards sensitivity to subtler things. And who made that? Did you choose to make yourself inquisitive? No, since childhood I was always curious. I used to ask questions. So who made that? Nature again. So when you start thinking about it in these terms, you really come to the conclusion that almost all of our evolution is driven by this nature, behind the scenes pushing us. And we can say, in a general sense, nature acting in all of human beings and equally in all animals and plants, but for the moment we focus on human beings, nature acting in all of human beings pushes in a particular direction. And in certain spaces on earth, she pushes to highlight an aspect, and in other spaces, another aspect, in another space, another aspect. But precisely because she wants a rounded development within each of these specialized spaces, she creates a few in whom she pushes in the other secondary and tertiary aspects, underlying the overall primary aspect. And in the other primary aspect, the other elements come as secondary or tertiary aspect. And so what you see everywhere on earth, there is as if a multifaceted push of nature to develop the same overall goal but with specializations and sub-specializations. And then when you look at the big picture going back a few thousand years, you see how nature used lineages of families to develop specialization of psychological types, to build local culture, and even to imprint it in the genetic patterns. So it's interesting to this day, especially in spaces of the world where the families have held their lineages and have not mixed too much, to this day you can find those patterns valid. I have perhaps shared some examples before, and it's worth repeating here. I recall going to a family in Punjab and I asked them, what do you do? And they said, we are into manufacture of electronic components. It was something to do with tiny electronic circuits. I said, where does this come from? What made you go into this field and not another? And they didn't know. Well, just like that, we liked it, we found it interesting. So I said, what were your ancestors doing? And they said, we were into furniture manufacture. Now think about what that means. You take physical substance and make fine lined etches to make it beautiful, to express some aesthetic side. And what were they doing now? They were taking silicon chips and making fine etches of circuit boards and making it express a power of the intellect, but again a harmony and aesthetic, much more mental. And I could feel that continuity of the same power. I found similarly in certain lines of, often the family name gives you a hint. In one particular lineage, I was told that the family always used to be accountants to the kings. And it was interesting to see the current members of the family had this power of the intellect for numbers, familiarity with numbers, comparison, differentiation, critiquing numbers, finding errors in a balance sheet. That element of thinking was there. And sometimes it takes strange forms, but the form is not important, it's the particular faculty of the consciousness. And then Mother says in the 1960s, nature decided to mix everything, to create a rich diversity. So what you see here is all through nature has been leading all this. And so if nature has been pushing the power of the intellectual development, remember what Sri Aurobindo said, we read last time, she doesn't hesitate to push it forward at the cost of other elements that will need to be taken up fully hereafter. So she pushes the intellectual elements. It is as if all the other elements are beginning to be lost, but she is going to preserve them because later she will integrate them with the intellect. So to preserve them where? If in the large mass of humanity the sheltering elements are removed, then in a few pockets of humanity, in a few individuals, she must protect them and even push their development. So this is what you see happening now. She keeps alive her ulterior intentions in the minds of a few and uses man's greater mental evolution to raise them to a higher plane and deeper issues. Wherever she has developed sufficiently the greater possibility of the mental evolution, not stopping short with the superficial intellect, but a deeper power of the intellect. There you will see what she does is a higher plane and deeper issues. Often it will take the form of philosophical contemplation, or it may take the form of a science, but a scientist who goes deeper than just the mere superficial element. You will see at the same time as this extreme physical materialistic science was taking form 100 years ago, you had some of the best scientists of the age who were reading and studying religious or spiritual texts. The group of scientists in Germany who were the most advanced in atomic physics were all students of the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads, and caught many of these ideas and introduced them into their physics, which is what makes quantum physics so close even today in elements of the Vedantic thought. Einstein himself, when he first greeted the ambassador from India, greeted him in a chaste Sanskrit, and the ambassador didn't know Sanskrit, and he said, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Or the first scientist who was working on the atomic explosion, atomic bomb, when he saw this explosion, he was reminded of a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Now, that doesn't come spontaneously unless you have been a deep student of those verses. You've actually learned those verses, dwelt on them so long that the verse comes spontaneously. How is that possible? Here, they seem to be almost entirely engaged with the most materialistic form of science, and they seem to have this profound spiritual, philosophical content or bent, because they represented this higher part of the mind. You will see in science, those who lead science forward are those who have the deeper intuitive or spiritual content in their consciousness. The ones who follow are the ones who take only the physical formula of the science and repeat mechanically. They're the ones who stay with the more superficial element of the intellectual power. And in these people you will find, or on the other side, among the religious, there is an element which rises and says, but, questioning the limitations of religion, but what's the truth? And tries to go deeper and brings forward the mystical content and revives the mystical experience. So, uses man's greater mental evolution to raise them, and these are a few to begin with. But they are used at center points to influence the masses after. What happens in the mass evolution, therefore, is a passage through this hard intellectualism, which seems to reject everything, and then the hard intellectualism is led by these higher minds to re-accept the truth of these deeper elements, but through the filter of the intellect, as if to remove the encrustation of the half-knowledge or mixed truths with which the earlier phase of religion had bound itself in. So, but still, evolutionary keeps alive her ulterior intentions in the minds of a few. And in the present time itself, after an age of triumphant intellectuality and materialism, we can see evidences of this natural process. A return towards inner self-discovery, an inner seeking and thinking, a new attempt at mystic experience, a grouping after the inner self, a reawakening of some sense of the truth and power of the spirit begins to manifest itself. He's listed a whole range of entry points. And he says, present time itself, after an age of triumphant intellectuality and materialism, this natural process has begun. So natural process because it's led by nature. And it is inevitable. You will recall in our text that we were reading in the Synthesis of Yoga on Friday, we had a similar idea. Sri Aurobindo says, every time that humanity passes through an extreme of materialism, it is always followed by a phase of awakening to the deeper spiritual possibilities. And the same idea here, and the logic of it is mapped out. But he's going in detail in how that emerges. So in the present time, recall, Sri Aurobindo wrote this around, let's say, 1916, 1917. But when he writes, he is not thinking of that year. He's not thinking of that decade. He's looking at that entire century and looks ahead a few centuries. So we have to look at this whole phase of the transition. And that's why reading him, you will find he's describing today's condition. But it's interesting to notice the forms it took then and the forms it takes now, and there is a difference. There, the same pattern emerging was happening within a few, which represented the more awakened minds. Today, it is happening in a much larger mass and suggests that there is a wider awakening that has happened in the last 100 years, let's say. So, the age of triumphant intellectuality and materialism was over, where science said we can do anything. Science said we can even split the earth, we can even create all the miracles, but it has failed. At that time, 100 years ago, the first failures were seen in the emergence of quantum physics. Quantum physics had just come into its own. Science was grappling with the inability to explain subatomic particles. And first there was Einstein who gave the photoelectric theory, and suddenly particles were waves and particles at the same time. Then came quantum physics in various forms, and the neat, rigid Newtonian mechanical world model of a clockwork wound by God and then mechanically moving had been replaced by uncertainty underlying every particle. And so this triumphant intellectual materialism had passed, and suddenly something else had come in. Compare that with today. Today, those very ideas of quantum physics are so widespread. Almost every child is familiar with these things. When we speak of quantum entanglement, a term like this, which was so technical 100 years ago, is so common today. A child is taught that a particle separated from another at a great distance, if it is entangled at a quantum level, you flip one particle, the other flips. And the suggestion that there is an underlying unity that holds the whole universe. A term which David Bohm described as the implicate order. There is an order underlying, implied behind the appearances of disorder. And it's as if you're perceiving behind the veil of nature or the cosmos or the physical cosmos something beautiful but ordered and one, indivisible, transcending space and even transcending time in some of the experiments. And what does that describe to you? The spiritual consciousness. Because there is nothing material which is transcending space or time. And suddenly you're perceiving consciousness or spiritual or spirit underlying, but you cannot use those words still. But this has become now widespread. So we see the pattern then, we see the pattern now. The primary difference is the extent to which it has spread into humanity. So the return towards inner self-discovery. Today, this is so obvious. Everywhere you go, there is some attempt to find inner meaning. And it has taken a crude form first by the recognition that the intellect has failed us in what is called postmodernism. Modernity has failed, the power of intellect has failed. What do I want? What is true within me? What is my subjective reality? That inner self-discovery is one. And inner seeking and thinking. So inner self-discovery starts with who am I really? And then it takes the form of inner seeking and thinking. What are the underlying values which bring meaning to life? What works? What doesn't work? If you look at as an example in business, what used to be taught in business, let's say a couple of decades ago, was the mechanical reductionist intellect that said, if you can sell hard enough, you will be successful. If you can organize and structure the machinery of the company will make big money and grow. And what do they say today? If you're authentic, then you can lead your team. If your team is aligned to you in your core values, in your mission and your vision, then you will get somewhere. Now, what are you talking about? Nothing to do with external organization, all to do with inner seeking and thinking. What are you seeking? Is your seeking aligned to mine? Is it aligned to the company seeking? Then you fit, otherwise you don't. What do you think? Is that thinking aligned? That becomes basically a vision and mission. These are the two ideas which are implied in this seeking and thinking. And even they make you go through a couple of days of introspection to articulate what is our company's vision and mission. It doesn't make sense if you go back 30 years to even spend a few days sitting and thinking about what is it that you're really visualizing or aspiring for. But today, if you have not done that, you will get nowhere as a team because you're not aligned on an inner level, which is the definition of your success, a requirement for your success. And so when he's saying this 100 years ago, I'm wondering what people thought about it. Or they would say, no, that's not really true. But it was true in a smaller group, a much smaller group. Today it is widespread. You do not pass through the basic business management course if you have not gone through these core ideas. Where earlier it was belonging to a few, and maybe not in business management, it belonged to a few who were much more community oriented or had other priorities. The third entry point he mentions is a new attempt at mystic experience. Where earlier we recognized there were mystics, what is our approach today? In the circumstances of today, which do not allow you the freedom to go out into the forest, to retire into the cave, or to be a monastic, even in the true sense of the form of the past. Show me a monastic today who does not handle money. And I don't think you'll be able to find one. Or if at all they manage it, they are so few and they're on the brink of survival. They cannot integrate in any meaningful life. They cannot mix with people. Or they have somebody else following them who handles the money, but which is just an artificial separation. You have someone who is you handling the money, but you are not touching it. It's just an appearance. Show me a monastic who is spreading his teaching or a deeper value or knowledge, who does not have an institution that he has to run, for which then he has to go and seek money, for which he has to all the rest of the paraphernalia that follows. Or show me one who does not have a mobile phone. Yes, I have seen some who do not have that, but they still have an email ID, or they still have something by which you can reach out to them. And the few who don't, well, they cannot play any active role in society. Having accepted that, we cannot avoid these things. How do we live by those values? And the first question you ask is, what is the true monasticism? I met somebody in New York, young man. At that time he was young, he's much older now. And he came to India. He came from a Christian tradition, a mystical tradition, mystical seeking, came to India, entered the yogic experience, and then lived as a monastic, grew his hair, stopped cutting his hair until it became a complete matted lock. Not so nice to look at, but he went back to America, re-entered his life and said, I will live as a monastic in life. He began to serve people, the poor and the homeless, etc. in New York City. Eventually, he built up an institution, had to raise funds to be able to do his work. And then he came out with a book, which he called The New Monasticism, in which he said, well, we should be able to accept marriage, we should be able to accept engagement in all things and still be a monastic. And I met equally monastics who said, no, please don't spoil the name of monasticism, give it another name. A monastic cannot be doing exactly the same things as another. And there's this division. If you think about it, there's a truth in both positions. Sri Aurobindo puts it like this, that the true character of sannyas, renunciation, is an inner renunciation of ego and desire. And that was the true sense of the sannyas. And when you were initiated into the order of the renunciate, it was ego and desire that you were renouncing, which was reflected in the external form and symbolism of the ochre robes that you wore, or the things that you left behind, or in the initiation ritual, you took your old clothes and burnt them as an end of the previous life. You are born into a new spiritual life, you take on a new name, you're no more called by the old, you lose all your past family relations. It's a symbolic transition into a spiritual life. During a period when spiritual life and material life were separated. And you saw this in India, particularly in the last 2000 years, in a very strong way. It is not the Vedic ideal, and yet it was the only way spirituality could survive in a material space without seriously threatening the balance of society. But we are at a time today where spirituality cannot remain separate. And one of the most important messages of Sri Aurobindo's teaching is this, that the spirituality has to permeate all of life and all the parts of our being and raise them to their spiritual possibilities. So Mother even puts it in as a message. It's so important. She says, Sri Aurobindo came on earth to teach humanity that you do not need to leave life to live a spiritual life. Almost as if it's one of the central aspects of his work. But when you think of it in these terms, the truth of the monastic life has to be now taken only in its essential psychological and spiritual element. The form of it ceases to be, and yet what will be its practical character to be seen, because there are many ways in which it could be worked out. And maybe we will experiment, maybe we will fail, maybe we will find many approaches, and maybe each one has his own approach to be seen. In the Sri Aurobindo ashram, it took an unusual form where every disciple, as they came to Sri Aurobindo and the mother, gave everything they had. They owned nothing more anymore. And then the mother gave back to them what was necessary for their life, which they could dedicate. And everything they did, everything they were, was given to the divine. No sense of personal ownership or possession, not even of yourself. Now that's already a very specialized focus. Can you live that elsewhere? And one of my very close friends asked this question. He is a businessman with a family, with children, responsibility for his larger family, having to deal with money, with governments, with corruption. And he said, but I want to live the ashram life. And I said, nothing stops you. The only correction you have to make is, consider everything you have as given to you by the mother to be looked after by her in her place, as her trustee. So the money in your bank account is not yours, it is hers. But you are her trustee to exercise it for the proper use, which includes the family, which is also given to you by her, including your wife and your children and your parents and everyone else. They're given to you by her to be looked after. So you may spend the money for their well-being also, without guilt. But you have to spend it the way she would want you to spend, to the best of your capacity. And when you have to deal with the government, to develop your business, etc., similarly, it's her business that you're looking after. You could take it a step further and say, even this body is given to you by the Divine Mother. After all, who built it up? You did not. Did you tell each cell and control each cell to grow? No, it happened by nature. Nature made your body grow, gave you intelligence, gave you strength, gave you courage. Everything you have is given to you. And you can treat it as belonging to the divine and put it in dedication to the divine. And if you begin to live even a little bit in this direction, and bit by bit it can grow, then you grow very rapidly in the direction of the truth of the spiritual values which are inherent to the monastic order, but without needing the forms of the monastic tradition. And yes, there will always remain a few who may follow that form, and it will have its place. Perhaps as an extreme, as an inspiration to others of a certain form in which things could be practiced. But each one may find their own. But the idea behind this is that you need to find the mystical experience through a new gateway, in your own manner, in the new circumstances. So a new attempt at mystic experience. You cannot repeat what was then because circumstances are so different. A groping after the inner self. Every now and then, one experiences a shock of life. Suddenly, someone dies who was close to you, who was too young to die, unexpectedly goes, and you are made to question, what happens to me? What about my life? What is important for me? What am I really doing here? Why am I here? Who am I really? And you don't have the tools. You're not equipped to really find answers, but you're trying, and it's a sense of groping. The groping description is an accurate description because you're entering a space which for you is dark. And in darkness, you're trying to feel, randomly projecting your hand, trying to feel where's the wall, where is the what I'm looking for, the table, the chair, the wall, the things. And I'm turning within, where is my sense of meaning? Where is my sense of purpose? Where is my sense of I or my deeper values? So groping after the inner self. And as a result of all these, a reawakening to some sense of the truth and power of the spirit begins to manifest itself. And it's just a beginning. And it's only some sense of the truth and power of spirit that you touch, but you awaken to. It was always there. You were not conscious. And now you've become more conscious because you started looking. So after this age of triumphant intellectuality and materialism, there is this tendency towards a reawakening. Man's search after his self and soul and a deeper truth of things tends to revive and resume its lost force. So what happened in between, while intellect was becoming so strong, the force of the spirit had receded. Where earlier you believed in the gods and the subtle powers because you felt them. And when you feel them, you cannot deny their reality. With the increase of intellect, you lost that feel. And so gods and powers were just a superstition, a belief, a symbol maybe. And you could throw it away. But now as you reawaken, you begin to sense once again these deeper truths of yourself, of course, first. And then its reflection outside. And so the force of things begins to revive, the lost force. And there's a fresh life which is given to all the things which you had thrown aside. A fresh life to the old creeds. Erect new faiths or develop independently of sectarian religions. These are the three forms in which things get revived. I want to give an example here. Again, something I've shared, but these are some examples so poignant, they're worth repeating, and it's difficult to find good ones otherwise. I was in Vishakhapatnam at the Indian Naval Base. We had a training program for the people in the Navy. And after that, some young cadet trainee in the submarine division was assigned to take me to a submarine museum. They had converted a submarine itself into a museum. And as we were going in, he said, what you were saying was very interesting, and you are from the ashram, he wanted to know more. Then on his own, he began to get pensive. And so I asked him, where are you from? And he said, well, my family or my village is in the Himalayas, high up in the mountains. I said, what's a mountain man doing here in the ocean? He lives underwater most of the year. And he said, well, it just happened like that. And then as he was pensive, he was introspecting, he said spontaneously, when I'm here, all those things are unreal to me, spiritual things. All those things are unreal. But every year I go back to meet my family, and as I'm driving up the mountains, as I rise up the heights, I can feel once again the presence of the gods, and everything becomes real. And I live with my family for a few months. And then once again, as I drive down, all of those things begin to recede and I lose everything, and it is unreal when I come back to the plains. It's a very interesting observation. Every year he goes through this reawakening and re-losing. And it has to do with the physical space almost. Or something within his consciousness. As he goes home, perhaps his heart opens out more And when he comes back to the plains, his intellect engages much more with the world that he has to run based on the intellect and not the heart. And this is the problem we face in a large part of the world, where the heart which senses and the intellect which denies are as if in conflict with each other. And it's clear, because he came fresh from the village culture, that he will pass through the hard intellectual passage and then re-embrace the truth of this, maybe on a deeper level. But this is an individual's journey. The same can happen to an entire group or a culture or civilization. If you look at the whole of India, there is this hard turn to materialism in a large part of India, and then a rapid return. But in Europe, the hard turn to materialism is much longer, much harder, much harsher and more destructive. And the return takes longer also and is more slow. And so you see variations, but everywhere you see this return. So the lost force is as if revived. And when the force comes, you can't say it is not true, because you feel it. So it gives fresh life to the old creeds, erects new faiths, or develops independently of sectarian religions. I was in Ireland. We went on top of a hill, which was a sacred hill. There was one of those stone arrangements. There was a little cave with some sacred ritual belonging to the Celtic tradition. The full sense of it is mostly forgotten. But the symbols are there. It doesn't make sense when you look at them, and yet you can feel something. And while we were there, there was a woman who came, an elder woman with what was obviously her younger daughter. She came there and they were doing something. We could feel that they were sensitive, they were feeling the space. And on their own, they came to us and began to chat. So the woman said that she is one of those who has still some memory of the old Celtic tradition, and her young daughter is the one to whom she is teaching. And I asked her, are you transmitting to the next generation? She said yes, and the daughter smiled. It was interesting to see what she was transmitting was what remained with her. And what remained? Only the components which were still living. The components which had lost force obviously are forgotten if you go down a few generations. Only what has force of experience lives. Or with that force, something further opens out, and finer elements which were lost now begin to be felt and relived. So we were fortunate. There was another lady who took us to see all the sacred Celtic places, and she lived it. It was interesting to see. She brought us to a tree and she explained how on this tree we tie these strings as with prayer. And then she said, in these places where there are these stone rings, you have to be careful, because in the old days they said there are beings there, and these are portals. If you cross over and you come back after a few minutes, 20 years pass in our world. And as she was saying all this, you could feel that she lived that world. She lived the reality of it. And to be led by someone like that was interesting, because it gave you a feel of how that tradition may revive itself. Having passed through the phase of hard intellectualism, maybe it was not so hard in Ireland though. In England it was much harder. Scotland not so hard again. It had still retained some elements of the mysticism. So you can see how it will come, and you get a glimpse of where it might go. So it takes three forms. First is that old creeds. So the ritual form of it comes back. You'll see a lot of this now coming back in what is coming through as Wicca. Wicca brings elements of what was dismissed as witchcraft by the church. Wicca in its origin, certain elements of ritual relating to the moon, for example, dancing under the full moon in the forest. For what? Entering in relation with what the moon represents. She is Diana. What does she represent? And if you feel that, the ritual has a meaning. Or going through the ritual, you feel something of its uplifting character, it has a meaning. Otherwise, it's a ritual to an end. And unfortunately, a lot of the Wicca, which is practices of that kind, you do this and your wishes will be fulfilled. She will grant your desire. that goes back into a little bit of the low-grade occultism. But still, there are elements of the old creed which are being revived and receiving fresh life. Not everyone will accept it though, having passed through this intellectual phase. Or erect new faiths. You see Swami Dayananda 100 years ago attempting to revive the Vedic tradition. More recently, you see Maharshi Mahesh Yogi reviving the Vedic tradition. Big difference. Swami Dayananda began the revival of the ritual of the traditional form of practice. Maharshi Mahesh Yogi integrated that knowledge with current science and technology and the forms in which technology could validate or give new form to articulations of these things. And it acquires a different character. Or sectarian or develop independently of sectarian religions. And here you will see the mystical elements, as I mentioned earlier, contemplative mystical Christianities completely breaking away from sectarian component elements or structures, forming their own groups, subgroups, communities even. It's interesting in Hawaii, in the Bahamas, there is a ashram. I forget now the name of the ashram. You go there and you have these white American swamis, dressed like traditional Indian swamis. Everywhere you go in their ashram, you find traditional idols of Ganesha, Saraswati, Lakshmi, Shiva, Parvati. They have rituals and pujas which they do in all the traditional manner, chanting the Sanskrit texts. Everything you would say is Hindu religion, but they'll say, we are not Hindu. We are not religion. We are following our own spiritual path. And you wonder, what does that mean? But independent of. And this need to be independent of sectarian traditions is interesting because it's so sometimes obviously false, and yet the need is interesting because it takes these forms where anybody teaching will say, we are not a religion, we are just a spiritual culture or movement or a way of life or whatever term they use. Or it takes another form where they say, I am not a guru, I am only there to help you. What are you doing? You're trying to cut away from a certain form which to you has acquired a corrupt character. Maybe it's not corrupted. Maybe to your mind or to some propaganda it has a corrupt element. But you need to separate from it to create your own independent, even religious form. The intellect itself, having reached near to the natural limits of the capacity of physical discovery, having touched its bedrock and found that it explains nothing more than the outer processes of nature, has begun still, tentatively and hesitatingly, to direct an eye of research on the deeper secrets of the mind and the life force, and on the domain of the occult, which it had rejected a priori, in order to know what there may be in it that is true. Rejected a priori, and the very first glance, without even bothering to validate. The intellect had rejected all of the old traditions and all of the old knowledge, saying, oh, that's wrong, I alone know better. I am the new awakening, the new light which will replace all that false light. Again, it has a character of a religious, narrow, sectarian, and yet inherently, because science is self-correcting and evidence-based, it tends to outgrow its own narrowness. What happens then? It keeps widening, but at some point it cannot widen. And what's the limit? The natural limits of the capacity of physical discovery. What happened initially in the physical discovery was you took physical objects and demonstrated physical phenomena. Soon as you peeled off layers of appearance, you went to deep layers where you could not hold the object that you're studying. Can you hold a molecule? Yes, but we can even hold a physical cell. You cannot, it's too small. Yes, but we can see it through the microscope. But how do you know the microscope actually reveals the cell? You see, you could apply the same argument when the mystic says, I see in my inner sight that there are these beings who preside over nature's functions. How do you know your seeing is not an illusion because of the manner in which you see? And you could ask the same way, how do you know the physical glass is not creating a distortion in your microscope? The same argument applies. Well, the scientist goes deeper and deeper until even the microscope cannot see. So then we create what is called electron microscope, meaning you use electrons to see electrons. You cannot see them with your eyes. So you are now using an indirect method to throw things which you cannot see on things which you cannot see, and somehow through that interaction evoke a pattern of scattering which reflects in your detectors as little pulses of light, from which through a mathematical formula you reconstruct what the appearance of the object should be to create such a scattering. Do you see the logic of it and the indirection of it? And yet it's hard science. So you have used invisible things to measure invisible things and used formula which is entirely mathematics of your mind, abstract from physical world, to reconstruct what the physical world should be like. And then you created a picture on your computer screen, but it's not the atom really. And yet you say you've seen and photographed the atom, or you've photographed the black hole, or whatever else. But you go still further and your equipment fails because you're touching things which equipment cannot, even through these indirect means, have any grasp on. So he says, limits of the capacity, natural limits of the capacity of physical discovery, having touched its bedrock and found that it explains nothing more than the outer process of nature. So when you've gone down to the deepest levels of subatomic physics, all you have is the standard model. And do you know what the standard model does? It's just a mathematical construction to describe the current scattering patterns of particles hitting other particles. That's all. It is not a theory which was built from prior assumptions. It's just a mathematical construct to fit the evidence of what you've observed. When you state it like that, it is shocking. But this is the reality of it. The standard model was not created by the theory which was validated. It was just a mathematical construct to fit the data. So what does it show you? Nothing more than the data. What does it predict? Nothing more than the data. At best, it predicts a particle that we missed, which should be here. There's a gap, because otherwise the description would be incomplete. And this particle should have such and such quality and property. So let's check. Oh yes, we just found there is such and such quality and property. We discovered a new particle which was predicted by our theory. But no, you just completed the mathematical description which you had imposed on the data. That's all. Nothing new was added, nothing was removed. And so it helps you nowhere to explain reality. You have described, you have explained nothing. Now, if you understand that this is true at subatomic particles, it is equally true at higher levels of reality, at an atomic level, at a molecular level, even at a physical, constitutional and substantial level. Even in the biology, even in the psychology, we only describe, we explain nothing. The descriptions may get more and more complex or sophisticated, but they explain nothing. Why is E equals mc square? Well, that's how it is. That's what you come back to. That's the law of the universe, you say. But what makes the law that? We don't know. That's what we observe. So at that point, having touched its bedrock and found that it explains nothing more than the outer process of nature, and Sri Aurobindo is suggesting there is behind this an inner process which will explain these formula, from which the formula rises. But that inner process itself must be fundamentally free of formula. Otherwise, it would not explain it. If you just give me another formula which describes or explains this formula, it's not an explanation. An explanation will be something which transcends the formula and explains why the formula comes, itself being therefore not bound by formula. What do you call such an explanation? You see how very quickly it would approach the direct perception of the underlying consciousness and process of nature, which is not bound to formula, which is consciousness based and free action of nature, and even led by conscious beings and powers of nature. But you've stopped at outer process, and so the intellect has begun, still tentatively and hesitatingly, to direct an eye of research on the deeper secrets of the mind and the life force, and on the domain of the occult. Now, remember 1916? I mentioned J.B. Rhine was one of the early explorators of the parapsychological phenomena. And I gave the example of the playing cards. He did lots of experiments with tossing coins and influencing the toss of the coins. The data that he built up at that time is unmatched to this day for its scientific validity and standards. You can publish it in any of the journals today, nobody can question it. It was so well done as an experiment. But after his phase, you find almost 50, 60, 70 years where almost nothing is done. A few scatterings, but nothing of that type. And then more recently in the 1980s and 90s, once again, they reapproached this question, but now through technology. Where he was tossing coins and opening cards, you have random number generators and electronic circuits which are throwing out images or numbers at random. And your mind is trying to influence those. What has changed is only the medium in which the experimentation is being done after a long gap. But the pattern of experimentation is same, but now more widespread. In fact, you can buy those random number generator chips and do them in your own home. You do not need specialized equipment. So the moment people start exploring and applying this technology, it will suddenly hit a very wide range of possibilities of exploration. But what are you looking at? Deeper secrets of the mind and life force and the domain of the occult. So here was the question, how can your mind influence the playing cards or perceive the playing cards? How can it see ahead in space or in time? Or today, the same variation, how does your mind influence the electrons, protons, neutrons and their agitation, which gives rise to a pulse of electricity which makes for this random number pattern? This whole experiment, I'll only touch upon it briefly, called the Global Consciousness Project, which has more than 65 computers all over the earth with these random number chips, measuring random number pulses, which are categorized in a single big computer with mathematical analysis to measure randomness of these random streams. Okay? So what you get is a final number which rises when the streams become less random and it falls when the streams become more random. What does it mean? You're measuring oscillations of atoms at 65 different locations and they are giving random streams. But suddenly you discover they all become less random. They become more coherent and then again they fall back into randomness. And then the experiment itself leads to the observation that every time there is a major event in which human minds are aligned to a single thought or idea, you find the randomness of these atoms becoming less. So let's say in Bay of Bengal, there was a tsunami, 2004, I believe, and more than 150,000 people died. Nothing changed. But when the news hit the television screens and people began to see and were shocked or were thinking of the same thing, the randomness of these random number generators dropped. All the atoms began to synchronize. It's as if the atoms were reflecting the alignment of the human mind. Now, I give another example. Every New Year's Eve, and we're about to approach one such, the 10 seconds before midnight, people are concentrating on countdown. And everybody in the midst of the party stops and everyone turns to this one pointed thought. And at the moment of midnight, they all fall apart in celebration of chaos. In those 10 seconds, the randomness of all these atoms becomes less. They become synchronized, coherent, and the graph rises. And then at midnight, it falls. Except on Earth, there are time zones. And what you see is across time zones, the wave of coherence moves on the surface of the earth. Now, the implications of this is staggering. One of the implications is that you're measuring only a few atoms, but every atom on earth, at this very moment, when we are aligned and synchronized in thought, every atom is more coherent in its vibration and is influenced directly by the state of our collective mind. One implication. The whole earth itself is influenced by the collective mind of humanity. And local spaces are influenced by the collective mind of the local spaces when we are more aligned or more chaotic in mind and life. Another implication is, if this is true of this room right now, when we are all aligned to a single thought, all the atoms here are quiet or more aligned in resonance. What happens to our own physical body, which is the container of our mind and emotions all the time? Our state of mind and thoughts is affecting the randomness of the atoms of our body, and as a result, the cellular working of our body, isn't it? When we are more chaotic in thought, there is a breakdown because of the increased randomness of our cells, and we fall sick more easily. When we are more coherent in our mental consciousness and life force, our atoms align and synchronize, our molecules align, our cells align, our biological functions align, and we become more healthy, more coherent, less sick. The same would be true in a collective space of a city. If more people, and this is one of the experiments done by Maharshi Mahesh Yogi and his team, that they had a group of people praying, 1,000 people praying in a city. During the time of the prayer and the immediate aftermath of the prayer, crime in the city dropped dramatically, measurably. Objective measures. So you're observing through such experiments, which are almost entirely physical in their origin, you're observing mind and powers of mind and effect of mind on matter. But this is just the beginning, and then deeper powers of the life force. People can heal or direct life force on a plant, increase its growth, heal it, cause it to sprout, cause it to die just by directing energy at it. And all of these are being done in laboratories. Institute of Noetic Sciences is one major center for such experiments. And one of the forms in which they do this energy transmission experiment, they call it Shaktipat, drawing from the yogic tradition. There are those spiritual teachers who claim to be able to direct a spiritual energy on a student or a patient and cause a shift in consciousness, not merely a boost of life force. Can you measure it? And they're doing that, in fact. In a room where the patient or the disciple is isolated from all electromagnetic waves, the person is asked to direct energy on, off, on demand, and on the other side, they're measuring the symptoms of shift of consciousness, shift of life force, behavior, etc. And what have you come to? The perceptions of what were taught in the occult knowledge earlier, and the value given to these things which had been rejected, and now we are beginning to come back, which it had rejected a priori, in order to know what there may be in it that is true. And so the intellect turns upon all that it had thrown away. But now we understand why it needed to reject, and in the act of turning back, it draws out things, but from a poise of consciousness that has emerged from an instinctive to an intellectual, organized, developed mind, looks back to take the elements which are still relevant to be given new form and integrate it into this consciousness, but inevitably recognizing that the intellect is insufficient and now not falling back to the more instinctive subliminal impulses, but turning towards a higher intuition to integrate and awaken to the deeper spiritual truth behind what were the early forms of the religion. Religion itself has shown its power of survival and is undergoing an evolution, the final sense of which is still obscure. You see how after 3 generations of intense suppression by communism in the USSR, when communism was lifted, sudden surge of religion. even dramatic surge. Why? It seemed as if communism had declared religion was the drug of the masses, but now suddenly it comes back after having been thrown out as a drug, and many other variations which have come up. So, what does that indicate? What is, we know, we can see it survives, but what is the evolution in this religion? Something has changed even though it has survived. What is the final sense of it? That is not seen. And the possibility of a decisive turn and advance to the spiritual evolution is now appearing quite strongly before us, which he describes next in the rest of the paragraph, which we will take up next Sunday in the continuing study. What we have looked at now is the first crude formation of religion with its three other components, in all four components, and then out of that the emergence of the intellect as a superstructure which tended to break down and cut away those finer elements which it couldn't recognize. And then in the higher part of the human mind, an exploration, and then eventually the insufficiency of the intellect itself meeting this exploration to turn back to the truths so rejected to be taken up now towards a higher turn which will point to the spirit and not stop short with the creeds, with the occultism, or with the mixed perceptions which were only available at the lower range of the consciousness. Intellect is a link point, Sri Aurobindo points out, and this is the Vedic affirmation. Intellect links the lower instinct to the higher intuition. But in between, as a link point, it must come into its own to complete the individualization of the human being. Sri Aurobindo describes this hard turn of the age of the intellect as the age of individualism and reason. Reason prevails over all else, but also asserts its individuality and the necessity for each one to think for themselves and find their own answer. Until then, religion was found by a few who had found a truth and now articulated it in a way that everybody else had to follow. But others were not capable of validating the truth or going to the deeper spiritual possibilities. But now, having passed through this phase of individualism and reason, each one now turns to the truths of that religion in order to absorb or embody and then articulate in a way unique to each one, which was not possible before. And there you get a link, a hint of what religions are heading for. Where earlier it was a uniformity imposed, a groupthink even, a belief system, which Sri Aurobindo speaks of very harshly in how it suppresses the human possibilities. Now it will lead to an individual awakening and an individual relation to the divine, maybe within a framework, maybe free of frameworks, using frameworks to the extent it helps. But that would be the beginning of the true spirituality. As Swami Vivekananda points out, when religions divide themselves until everyone has his own religion, that's spirituality. So that's the direction in which you see things moving. And so that's the secret sense he is pointing to. And more, which we will look at. And then what happens to occultism? What happens to the other tendencies which had branched out? How do they join or unify in this upward spiritual turn? We will see that next Sunday. At the moment, we can take a few minutes to review and dwell on what we have read.